Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for returning to our gaming track. We're so excited to have you. We have an amazing presentation for you here today. I would like to welcome Jeffrey Yohalem to the stage, the virtual stage. Give him a big, big virtual round of applause. And I will let him take it away. And I will be here, of course. If you need anything, Jeffrey, welcome to the stage. Please turn on your camera and audio.
Hi, Dan. Thank you so much for having me here with you today. And I guess let's get started.
Sounds good.
So let me share my screen. There we go. All right. So my name is Jeffrey Yohalem. I'm a narrative director at Ubisoft. I started working there in 2006 on Rainbow Six, and then jumped to Assassin's Creed and helped build the world of Assassin's Creed and wrote parts of Assassin's Creed 2, and then wrote Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, created the puzzles in those games, and then Far Cry 3, and co-created and wrote Child of Light. And then I've worked on Tomb Raider and some other franchises as well. And then most recently wrote Immortals Phoenix Rising. And I'm here to talk to you about creative applications of AI in video games. I'm going to talk about a brief history of AI in games, which you probably know a lot about, but from more of the creative perspective. And then I'm going to talk about innovative applications of AI in existing video games, and then a little bit of behind the scenes, and then kind of a vision of some potential avenues for the future. So I'm going to start, at the beginning of video games and just do a really quick rundown of where AI has been. This is a game that everyone knows, Space Invaders, and you're against enemies in that game. But surprise, this is not AI, of course, because those enemies are hard-coded. All of their movements are predetermined before the player even plays. And, as they disappear, they're removed, but all of the movements were planned. So that was not, in fact, AI. And really, the first video game AI is in Pong, where, you have a second player who is the AI, and it can track where the ball is going to come. And then, they added some human error into the paddle, and also it moves faster or slower as the game gets harder. So this, shows probably the most important use of AI in video games, which is for enemy AI. And this is, from Prince of Persia. This was very simple, where, the player could do a block or could attack, and the enemy would basically be on a kind of pattern, and you had to figure out how to defeat that pattern to defeat the enemy. And, in first-person shooters, enemy AI is super important because the enemies will flank or run away or try to get you out from cover. And those are all, on a decision tree. They're figuring out what they're going to do. And then there's also pathfinding. This is a shot from Assassin's Creed where you're fleeing from enemies, and the enemies are trying to find the player and kill the player. And so pathfinding was super important in video games. And historically, they're at the beginning, level designers had to place, hidden paths in the world itself and target objects as places for enemies to hide or crouch down, or, so that enemies wouldn't clip through them. And so this was done a lot by hand, as opposed to using complex AI. Then there's also companion AI. This is one of the first games to use it, with Sonic and Tails. In this case, Tails just mirrored the player's actions about 2 seconds after. So it was very simple. It got more complex in something like Rainbow Six with a squad-based AI, where you could order the AI to go do things for you. And again, this is an example of a game where the level designer was putting paths and locations where you could send your squad to take cover. They had to flag those locations as cover locations. So because of the limitations of companion AI, it's very difficult to get a companion to follow you properly. The companion can get in the way of you. You're trying to shoot other enemies and the companion gets shot themselves, or, you can't see the enemies because they're in your way from the camera perspective. Designers kind of looked at this and said, okay, what are some interesting ways that we could take advantage of that limitation. And so you have something like Resident Evil 4, where you have to protect the companion AI from being killed, and that companion AI can't do much except kind of cower. And so the player is the one who has to shoot and make sure they don't die. And it limits, the AI doesn't need to be super smart to have that be an interesting gameplay. Same thing with like this collection idea that came from BioShock Infinite, where it's like, okay, what if the companion doesn't attack and doesn't get in your way? Because it's first person, whenever you would look away from Elizabeth, she would disappear and reappear somewhere else. And so they would teleport her all over the place so she wouldn't be in your way. And then she would also grab all of the loot that was in the map around you. So it made her super helpful, but it kind of transformed her into a tool rather than a person. So, when I talk about all of this is like very rapid trip through history, you see that like video game AI is in fact it's relatively simple. It's not cutting edge. There are decision trees. So you have like that shot of the soldiers from Fear. It's like they were deciding, do I make a run for it? Where's my health at? So you look at the decision tree, my health is low. Okay, I'm going to make a run for it. Is the player in the way of my escape? Yes or no? If yes, I'm going to hide behind an object. If no, I'm going to make a run for it. So it's all, there's a very simple set of choices. And again, heavily scripted, like in the case of flagging things as cover objects, that the designer has to flag them themselves so that the AI looks smarter. And then it's also glitchy. Often enemies get stuck behind objects, or they clip through an object. They can't navigate the environment properly. So there's a lot of level design work that goes into making AI look smarter in games historically. So now let's look at some innovative applications in existing games where those weaknesses are kind of transformed into strengths. So the first one I'll talk about is a game that many people probably know, which is Halo. The enemies in Halo are the Covenant. There are these space aliens that are attacking the Earth, and they behave logically. In the sense, you throw a grenade at them, they jump away from the grenade. If they get a sticky grenade attached to them, they run and try to get it off them and then explode. And so they act naturally, what you would expect from normal enemies. Well, there's this other enemy in the game called the Flood that infects Covenant and humans alike, and it's this parasite. And they become like this creepy creature that you see on the screen. And so if you fire a sticky grenade at that creature runs for you, the player, and blows you and the player up. And that's really important to understanding that creature's backstory, because they're a symbiotic organism. Like basically they are all one. All the members of this organism are considered cells of a living body. And so one small piece of it is worth sacrificing because the whole remains intact. And so unlike the Covenant before that behaves logically, this behaves logically according to the Flood's logic, which is that sacrificing this one small part of itself is not relevant. It's like losing a skin cell. And so that weird AI behavior teaches you a huge amount about this organism. And they also do this with these creatures called grunts. They're these little guys, and there's usually a Covenant lieutenant that's around them. If you shoot the lieutenant and kill the lieutenant, they all flee. All the little guys stop attacking you and they run away. And so it turns out that these are another species that have been enslaved by the Covenant. They're cowards and they're controlled by them. And so if you kill their controller, the lieutenant, then they, as cowards, are left, uncontrolled, and they run. And so it teaches you again about their backstory. This strange AI behavior is actually used to build character. Another great example of innovative AI in video games is Black and White. Here you have a pet, this gigantic creature here that you can either reward. So it does actions somewhat randomly like a real animal. And like if it eats a person, you can pet it or give it like more food as a reward, or you can hit it as a punishment. And depending on what you do to the pet after every one of its actions, it learns what is acceptable behavior and what is not acceptable behavior. And then that in turn changes its physical attributes. So if you reward it for eating people, it becomes more dark and there's more kind of, it gets demonic characterization and becomes very frightening. Whereas if you reward it for taking care of people and being gentle with people, it becomes more godly and light and bright. And so this was a great way of using AI, that it relies on the player's thought process. And this came out around the same time as The Sims, which does something very similar. Another great use of AI that's innovative is randomly generated levels. Spelunky here is a screenshot from this game, really popularized that, but recently Hades uses this, and there are many roguelikes that use this idea. That you have elements that you want taught in a certain progressive order. So the gameplay elements are set, but the levels always randomly generate. So you have a certain kind of element that's going to appear in these levels, but the levels themselves completely random. And so that's great because you can't look online for a walkthrough. Every player has to experience the game as the designer intended and can't cheat. And also, they have to learn the skill that they're being taught at that particular moment in order to survive. Another great example of using AI for characterization is God of War, which came out pretty recently. So the AI is Atreus, which is Kratos' son. You play Kratos, the God of War, and this is his son. So in that game, at first, Atreus won't attack enemies at all, and just kind of runs around the screen and does nothing other than yell or react. And then there's a moment where you, as the father, encourage Atreus to help you in combat and help you kill, and then he kills someone for the first time, and it's very frightening and upsetting for him. But then he becomes this warrior as you're playing the game, and he becomes more and more powerful as an AI, helping you kill more and more enemies, but that transforms him as a character. So that the annoyingness of him not helping you in combat is resolved, but then it has troubling effects on his personality. Another good example of this actually is, if anyone played it, The Last Guardian. You have a pet, this gigantic pet, and the pet is very difficult to maneuver, but you need to maneuver the pet to different locations in order to climb up to them and get through the game. And so eventually you can do that, but the AI is imperfect. It's very difficult because creating great AI is very difficult. And so in that case, because it's a wild animal and it doesn't always listen to you, they explain why the AI is imperfect in it by using characterization, which really works in my opinion. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about behind the scenes uses of AI. Right now there's a lot of games that are working on text to speech, where you write something in a script. So I'm a narrative director and a writer, so I'm talking about this from my particular expertise. But when you write something into a script, you want to see it in game almost immediately, because you then can see whether the timing of it works, whether you need to cut that dialogue in half. The hallway is only a certain length, and so if you want the dialogue to occur in the hallway, it needs to be this long. And so originally there was nothing like that. You just have subtitles, and then there was robot voice, and now there's like trying to create a natural sounding voice so you can really get a sense of the cadence, which is great with humor or any complex writing that a robot voice sounds stupid saying. So and then there's also world and map generation. This is a shot from Oblivion, Elder Scrolls 4. They generated their world using AI, and they pretty much left it. So you see in the screenshot, like the terraforming is really cool, but it feels a little bit artificial. And that sort of evolved in games like Fallout 3 to being more bespoke. So they would generate the world artificially, but then they would paint, you'd have an artist create all these unique, cool locations on top of that artificially generated world. And so that was a great way of using AI to create a complex starting point and then building on top of it. So what are some ways that AI could be used in the future, both in production and in games? I think, contract generation, this is sort of a joke, but it's also very much true, which is, because of the pandemic, we're working with a lot more contractors, and game companies are working with more contractors around the world because you can have meetings from anywhere. And so you need to generate all of these complex contracts in order to hire those people. And it's actually a lot of work. And so having an AI that would generate contracts to use with contractors, I think would be great. But also background conversation generation. So in an open world game, there are tons of people or fantasy creatures across this whole world, always having conversations and making the feeling that a world is full of life instead of empty. And so you need actors for all of those characters. You also need to write all of those conversations, and the player barely hears any of them. Most players are focused on the main storyline or on side quests, and they're not standing around listening to background conversations that characters are having. But if you had these characters in the world just standing around not talking, it would feel really artificial and not alive. And so you need to have small talk. It would be great if you could input key facts from the game world. So like, let's say, there's a brand new car dealership in the middle of town, you're playing GTA, and you want everyone to know that they have the coolest cars in the city, because later on in the main plot, you're gonna go talk to that dealer, and you're going to end up stealing those cars secretly. And so that's going to be a whole mission. And so you want to see that early on. So you're going to have a conversation between characters talking about that dealership, talking about how cool it is. And so if you could just write in, a couple of parameters for a conversation, like you need to be about this car dealership, here's some facts about the car dealership, and then AI could generate that whole conversation, that would be incredible. Also, you want the AI to react to things the player's done. So if the player robbed that dealership, you want a conversation about, did you hear the dealership got robbed? So again, if that was a parameter you could input and generate conversations in the background, that would be great. And also, digital text to speech. So in the future, if then we had voice banks and you could actually create those conversations without even hiring actors, so that it sounds real and the voices sound human and they're having those conversations in the background, that would be huge. Again, I used that earlier example from Oblivion of the terraforming of the world, and it looked kind of dead and artificial. And then something like Fallout 3 fixed that problem. That's what this would do, is you create, these wouldn't need to be perfect, but because they're in the background. And then the main story would be bespoke and written by hand and created, not with AI. And so having AI is to create this very complex, realistic background for games, I think is very helpful. I'd love to have an AI companion that evolves based on your actions. So sort of taking black and white a step further, where you have someone who's following you through the whole game, and then depending on what you do, they're watching you. So I use this example from Hook. It's the kid from Hook who starts out as Peter Pan's son, and then because he's hanging out with Captain Hook, he becomes more like Captain Hook because his dad is not around to take care of him. And so I love that an AI could watch you and watch what you do, and then depending on what you do, become a better or worse person, or become a darker person, or maybe that AI then becomes an enemy that you fight later on. So this character works with you through 2/3 of the game, and then maybe they're going to help you defeat the bad guy at the end, or they'll become the bad guy at the end. I think that that's pretty neat. There was also one, I don't know what happened. I think maybe one of the slides got messed up, but one of the innovative applications of AI that I wanted to talk about that I missed was Shadows of Mordor, based on this idea that you have this nemesis system in that game. And so you meet a random enemy out in the world, and if you kill that enemy or you attack that enemy, they actually rise, they come back into the game world, risen up through the ranks, and they become the boss of a bunch of other enemies. And you go attack a stronghold, and you have to defeat those enemies. And then you encounter this enemy that you attacked or killed earlier, who has scars where you attacked or killed them, and they become a big bad guy. And so that's a wonderful use of AI, where it's all these random, like any of the enemies you attack in the world can become a nemesis and become this big antagonist that you yourself have created through your own actions. So this would be an evolution of that idea too. So I'm just going to end talking about a little game that I had always wanted to make that was very close to my heart, that kind of chronicles the journey of AI from the beginning to the end in video games, where I would love to start out with a map where you have, you're trying to reach a treasure chest in a maze, it's 2D, and there's a cube. And so half of the map is you trying to reach your treasure chest, and the other half is this cube trying to reach an identical treasure chest. And at first, the cube just mirrors all of your actions, and you're trying to trap it behind a wall. Like the maze is slightly different on both levels. So you try to trap it and get to your treasure chest before it does by doing a mirror movement that stops it from going forward. And so you would finish the first level, and then as you keep going, the cube would start disobeying that mirror imagery and start to become, start to act complex and have strategy and, race you to the cube in different ways. And then ultimately it would become one map by the end, and you would be trying to get to your treasure chest. And there'd be a moment where you end up, your icon or thing the ground ends up crumbling, and you can't make it, you're gonna die. And that cube sacrifices itself for you to jump on it to get to the final treasure chest. And so it shows that it now has that spark of life, that it has consciousness, and that it's behaving imperfectly as a real person would. And you feel bad for this cube because you feel like it was your rival, and then it does something to save you at the end. And so I felt like that, reaching that place where you feel that spark of life is the goal for AI and video games, and through all of these different processes and art forms running in the background, we can get there. So thank you for coming to my talk, and I hope you enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. A big virtual round of applause for him. Everybody else, stick around, do some networking, and see you soon.